Welcome back, dear listener, to another soft-spoken stroll through the shadows of the past. Whether the night is just beginning for you or you're listening as sleep slowly arrives, I'm happy you've chosen to spend this time here with me. Let me know in the comments. Are you listening from somewhere far and quiet, or in the heart of a busy city winding down? And if these calming explorations bring a sense of rest, please consider subscribing. There are countless more voices from the past still waiting to be heard. This isn't just another tale of Roman decadence. This is the story of a woman who wielded influence over the most powerful man on earth, who challenged every social boundary of her time, and whose downfall would echo through history as one of the most dramatic political scandals ever recorded. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just who Messalina was, but how her choices rippled through the empire, ultimately sealing her fate in ways that still captivate historians today. But before we unravel this web of passion and politics, let me share something that might surprise you. Modern historians have spent decades trying to separate fact from fiction in Messalina's story, because the accounts we have were written by men who lived in a society that both feared and despised powerful women. What we're about to explore isn't just Messalina's story. It's a window into how history itself can become a battleground between truth and propaganda. I'm going to take you through 5 pivotal moments that defined Messalina's rise and fall, each more shocking than the last. We'll explore her calculated ascent to power, her scandalous public behavior that horrified Roman society, her political maneuvering that threatened senators and freedmen alike, her ultimate act of defiance that crossed every line, and finally, the brutal retribution that ended her life at just 20 years old. Picture Rome in the year 38 CE. The mad emperor Caligula has just been assassinated, and in the chaos that follows, an unlikely figure emerges as the new ruler. Claudius, the stammering, limping scholar whom everyone had dismissed as unfit for power, suddenly finds himself emperor of the known world. He's 50 years old, unmarried since his divorce, and desperately in need of legitimacy. Enter Messalina, barely 16, beautiful beyond measure, and possessing something Claudius desperately needs, the right bloodline. Valeria Messalina wasn't just any young Roman woman. Her family tree read like a who's who of imperial power. Her great-grandmother was Octavia, sister of Augustus himself. Her mother descended from Mark Antony. In her veins flowed the blood of Rome's founding dynasty, making her more blue-blooded than many emperors. When Claudius married her, he wasn't just taking a wife. He was cementing his claim to the throne through her ancestry. But here's where the story takes its first, dark turn. Messalina understood her value from the very beginning. While Roman wives were expected to be silent, supportive figures who managed households and bore children, Messalina had different plans. She recognized that her bloodline gave her leverage, and she intended to use every drop of it. Within a year of their marriage, she gave birth to Britannicus, Claudius's first legitimate male heir. Suddenly, she wasn't just the emperor's wife, she was the mother of Rome's future ruler. This elevated her status exponentially, but it also painted a target on her back. In the deadly game of Roman politics, being close to power meant being close to danger, and Messalina was about to discover just how treacherous that proximity could be. The early years of her marriage revealed a woman of extraordinary cunning. While Claudius struggled with the complexities of ruling an empire, dealing with rebellious provinces, managing the Senate, and overseeing massive public works projects, Messalina began building her own power base. She cultivated relationships with influential freedmen who had the emperor's ear. She positioned herself as a patron to ambitious young nobles. Most importantly, she learned to read Claudius's weaknesses and exploit them. Claudius, despite his intelligence, was remarkably naive about human nature. His academic mind could grasp complex legal principles and historical precedents, but he often missed the subtle machinations happening right under his nose. Messalina quickly realized that her husband's trust could be weaponized. When she whispered warnings about potential threats to his reign, he listened. When she suggested appointments or removals of officials, he often complied. Without realizing it, Claudius was allowing his young wife to accumulate unprecedented influence over imperial affairs. But power, especially power gained through manipulation, comes with its own intoxicating effects. As Messalina's influence grew, so did her appetite for more. The quiet, behind-the-scenes maneuvering that had marked her early years as empress began to give way to increasingly bold and public displays of her authority. She started appearing at gladiatorial games with an entourage that rivaled the emperor's own. She began receiving petitions from citizens seeking imperial favor. Most shocking of all, she started making decisions that affected the lives and deaths of Rome's elite. The transformation wasn't lost on Roman society. Whispers began circulating through the city's taverns, bathhouses, and marketplaces. The empress was overstepping her bounds. She was forgetting her place. She was becoming dangerous. But these whispers, rather than intimidating Messalina, seemed to energize her. She had tasted real power, and she wanted more. This hunger would manifest in ways that scandalized even jaded Roman society. Messalina began hosting elaborate parties at the imperial palace, gatherings that pushed every boundary of acceptable behavior. These weren't merely social events, they were displays of her influence, carefully orchestrated to show Rome's elite exactly who held real power in the empire. Senators who had once looked down on her as a mere girl now found themselves competing for invitations to her gatherings, knowing that her favor could make or break their careers. The parties themselves became legendary for their excess. Ancient sources describe feasts that lasted for days, entertainment that shocked even Romans accustomed to spectacle, and guest lists that included everyone from senators and generals to actors and gladiators. This mixing of social classes was itself revolutionary in a society built on rigid hierarchies, but Messalina seemed to delight in breaking these ancient taboos. More troubling still were the reports of what happened at these gatherings. Messalina allegedly used these occasions to gather intelligence on potential rivals, to negotiate political alliances, and to identify threats to her position. What appeared to be mere hedonistic revelry was actually a sophisticated information-gathering operation, with the empress at its center, cataloguing the weaknesses, desires, and secrets of Rome's most powerful figures. But perhaps most dangerous of all was how these events affected Messalina herself. Each successful manipulation, each display of her influence, each moment of wielding power over men who should have been her superiors, fed a growing sense of invincibility. She began to believe that she was untouchable, that her combination of imperial blood, political cunning, and sexual charisma made her immune to the consequences that destroyed lesser mortals. This growing confidence would lead her to take risks that more cautious individuals would never have contemplated. She began to openly challenge traditional Roman values, not just in private settings, but in public forums where her behavior would be witnessed and reported throughout the empire. She started making appearances at the theatre, the circus, and even the gladiatorial schools, often without Claudius, surrounded by her own coterie of supporters and admirers. These public appearances weren't merely social outings, they were political statements. Every time Messalina appeared in public without the emperor, every time she received the adulation of crowds, every time she made decisions that affected public policy, she was asserting her right to wield imperial power independently. In a society where women's power was supposed to flow through their male relatives, Messalina was claiming authority in her own right. The implications of this behavior rippled throughout Roman society. If the empress could ignore traditional boundaries, what did that mean for other Roman women? If she could wield power independently of her husband, was she setting a precedent that threatened the entire patriarchal structure of Roman civilization? These questions weren't merely academic. They struck at the heart of Roman identity and social order. But Messalina's most audacious moves were yet to come. As her confidence grew, so did her willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened her position. or questioned her authority. What started as political maneuvering would soon escalate into something far more sinister, setting the stage for a series of events that would shock even the blood-soaked annals of Roman history. The transformation from ambitious young empress to something approaching a reign of terror didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, marked by increasingly bold moves that tested the boundaries of what even an emperor's wife could get away with. Each successful gambit emboldened her for the next, creating a dangerous cycle of escalation that would ultimately prove impossible to control. As we prepare to delve deeper into this extraordinary story, remember that we're not just exploring the life of one remarkable woman. We're examining the nature of power itself, how it corrupts, how it intoxicates, and how it ultimately destroys those who wield it without wisdom or restraint. Messalina's story is a mirror held up to every age, reflecting timeless truths about ambition, desire, and the deadly consequences of believing that rules don't apply to us. Now comes the blood. Because once Messalina had tasted the intoxicating rush of bending Rome's most powerful men to her will, once she had proven that her beauty and bloodline could open any door, close any mouth, or seal any fate, the logical next step wasn't restraint. It was elimination. The first to fall was Marcus Vinicius, a senator whose only crime was possessing something Messalina wanted: his wife. Not his wife's affection, mind you, but her social position, her connections, her usefulness in Messalina's growing web of influence. When Vinicius proved resistant to Messalina's subtle suggestions that he divorce his spouse for the good of the empire, he found himself accused of treason. The evidence was thin, manufactured, almost laughably transparent to anyone who cared to look closely. But who was going to challenge the empress? Who was going to risk their own neck by questioning her judgment? Claudius signed the death warrant without hesitation. His trust in his young wife had become absolute, dangerous in its completeness. When Messalina whispered that Vinicius posed a threat to their son Britannicus, when she painted pictures of conspiracy and rebellion, the emperor saw only a loving mother protecting their family's future. The reality that his wife was systematically removing anyone who might limit her power never crossed his scholarly mind. Vinicius died quietly, efficiently, as enemies of the state were meant to die. His widow, suddenly available and grateful for Messalina's protection, became a valuable addition to the empress's inner circle. The message to Rome's elite was unmistakable. Cooperation would be rewarded, resistance would be eliminated. But here's what made Messalina truly terrifying. She didn't stop at political enemies. She began targeting anyone who possessed something she coveted, anyone who had slighted her, anyone whose very existence reminded her that she wasn't yet untouchable. Asiaticus, one of Rome's wealthiest men, owned gardens that Messalina admired. His reluctance to sell them to her at the price she offered sealed his fate. Accusations of corruption followed, then a trial, then execution. The gardens became part of the imperial estate. Julia Livilla, Caligula's sister, and a woman whose imperial bloodline rivaled Messalina's own, represented a different kind of threat. She was beautiful, intelligent, and possessed the kind of natural gravitas that drew supporters without effort. Worse, she was unmarried, making her a potential bride for any ambitious general or senator looking to legitimize their own claims to power. Messalina couldn't allow such a wild card to remain in play. The destruction of Julia Livilla showcased Messalina's evolving sophistication in the art of character assassination. Rather than crude accusations of treason, she orchestrated a more subtle campaign. Rumors began circulating about Julia's private life, her alleged affairs, her supposed plots against the emperor. These whispers, carefully planted and nurtured by Messalina's network of informants, gradually poisoned Claudius against his own niece. When the final accusations came, adultery with the philosopher Seneca, conspiracy against the throne, They seemed almost inevitable. Julia Livilla was exiled to a remote island where she died under mysterious circumstances, officially from illness, though everyone understood the truth. Seneca himself narrowly escaped execution, saved only by Messalina's calculation that his death might create a martyr. Instead, he was exiled, neutralized, but alive, a living reminder of what happened to those who crossed the Empress. With each successful elimination, Messalina's methods grew more refined, more devastating. She learned to use Rome's own institutions against her enemies. The courts, the Senate, the very legal system that was supposed to protect Roman citizens became weapons in her arsenal. She discovered that the right accusation, delivered at the right moment to the right audience, could destroy anyone regardless of their wealth, connections, or innocence. More chilling still was how she began to enjoy the process. Ancient sources describe her attending the trials of her victims, watching from the imperial box as men she had marked for death pleaded for their lives. She would study their faces, their gestures, their final moments of hope before the inevitable verdict. This wasn't just political calculation anymore. It had become a form of entertainment, a way of asserting her dominance over life and death itself. The psychological transformation was complete. The ambitious girl who had married Claudius for security and status had evolved into something Rome had never seen before. A woman who wielded imperial power not through influence or manipulation, but through fear. Senators began to watch their words around her. Wealthy citizens started making discreet gifts to curry her favor. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the imperial family, began to treat her with the wary respect usually reserved for the emperor himself. But power built on terror has its own unstable foundation. Each execution, each exile, each demonstration of her reach created new enemies, even as it silenced existing ones. The families of her victims didn't forget. The friends of the dead didn't forgive. Most dangerous of all, the very institutions she was using to eliminate her enemies were beginning to understand how thoroughly they had been compromised. Narcissus, Claudius's most trusted freedman and secretary, was the first to recognize the true scope of what was happening. As the man responsible for managing the emperor's correspondence and appointments, he could see patterns that others missed. The steady stream of accusations flowing through Messalina's network, the convenient timing of deaths and exiles, the systematic removal of anyone who might pose even a theoretical threat to the empress's growing power. Narcissus faced an impossible choice. Confronting Messalina directly would be suicide. She had already demonstrated her ability to destroy far more powerful enemies, but allowing her to continue unchecked threatened not just individual lives, but the stability of the empire itself. If the emperor's wife could eliminate senators and nobles at will, if she could manipulate the legal system with impunity, if she could rule through terror while Claudius remained oblivious, then Rome itself was in mortal danger. The solution, when it came to him, was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attack Messalina directly, he would document everything. Every suspicious death, every convenient exile, every pattern of behavior that suggested conspiracy rather than coincidence. He began building a case, not for immediate use, but for the moment when it might be needed. Because Narcissus understood something that Messalina, intoxicated by her apparent invincibility, had forgotten. In Rome, no one stayed on top forever. Meanwhile, the Empress continued her deadly games, unaware that her most dangerous enemy wasn't a rival woman or a jealous senator, but a quiet freedman who understood the power of information. She had grown so confident in her ability to eliminate threats that she had stopped looking for them in unexpected places. This blindness to gathering danger would prove to be her first critical mistake. But even as Narcissus quietly gathered evidence, Messalina was preparing for her most audacious move yet. Having conquered the world of Roman politics through fear and manipulation, having bent senators and nobles to her will, having turned the imperial court into her personal kingdom, she was ready to claim something that no Roman woman had ever dared to pursue: actual political office, real governmental power exercised in her own name rather than through her husband. The precedent she was contemplating would have shocked Augustus himself. Roman women, no matter how noble their birth or how vast their wealth, were forbidden from holding magistracies, commanding armies, or exercising formal political authority. They could influence policy through their male relatives, but they could never rule directly. Messalina was about to challenge this fundamental law of Roman civilization. Her target was the consulship itself, the highest elected office in the Roman state. True, the consulship under the empire was largely ceremonial, with real power concentrated in the emperor's hands, but it retained enormous symbolic importance. The consuls were the heirs of the men who had founded the Republic, the successors to Brutus, and the other heroes who had expelled the last king. For a woman to claim such an office would be revolutionary, unprecedented, and utterly unthinkable to traditional Roman minds. Yet, Messalina began to lay the groundwork with characteristic cunning. She started by suggesting that certain consulships should be reserved for members of the imperial family, ostensibly to honor their service to the state. She proposed that the emperor's relatives should be given precedence in elections, ensuring that only the most loyal candidates could hold high office. These suggestions, presented as reforms to strengthen imperial authority, actually served to normalize the idea that birth and family connection, rather than merit or popular support, should determine who held power. The next step was more subtle still. She began appearing at Senate meetings, initially just as an observer, sitting in the section reserved for imperial family members. Her presence was unusual, but not unprecedented. Other empresses had occasionally attended important sessions, but gradually her role evolved. She started whispering suggestions to senators during debates. She began nodding approval or showing displeasure at particular proposals. Most significantly, she started making it clear which candidates she supported for various offices. These interventions had immediate effects. Senators who had ignored her preferences found themselves facing unexpected legal challenges. Candidates who courted her favor discovered that their campaigns ran more smoothly, their opponents withdrew more readily, their victories came more easily. Without any formal authority, Messalina was effectively controlling Roman elections through a combination of rewards and punishments. But informal influence, no matter how extensive, wasn't enough anymore. She wanted recognition, official acknowledgement of the power she already wielded. She wanted her name on laws, her image on coins, her authority codified in Roman legal tradition. She wanted to stop ruling from the shadows and step into the blazing light of acknowledged supremacy. This ambition would lead her into territory so dangerous, so unprecedented, so shocking to Roman sensibilities, that even her most loyal supporters would begin to question their allegiance. Because what Messalina was contemplating wasn't just political advancement. It was a complete overthrow of the social order that had defined Roman civilization for centuries. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just Messalina's fate, but the future of imperial Rome itself. The moment arrived when patience became impossible for Messalina. Her hunger for recognition had grown beyond whispered influence and shadow manipulation. She craved something that would cement her name in Roman law, Roman tradition, Roman memory forever. The consulship beckoned like a glittering prize, but even that seemed insufficient for someone who had already tasted the intoxicating rush of absolute power over life and death. What she devised next would have been unthinkable to any previous generation of Romans. If she couldn't claim formal political office immediately, she would create her own sphere of authority, her own court within the court, her own government operating parallel to her husband's. She began holding what she called consultations in her private quarters, inviting senators, governors, and military commanders to seek her counsel on matters of state. These weren't casual conversations between an interested wife and her husband's subordinates. These were formal audiences, complete with ceremonial protocols that Messalina invented herself. Visitors were required to request appointments through her personal secretary. They waited in antechambers decorated with her portrait alongside images of the gods. When finally admitted to her presence, they found themselves facing a woman seated on a throne-like chair, surrounded by scribes recording every word, flanked by guards who answered to her alone. The genius of this arrangement was its apparent informality. Technically, Messalina was simply offering advice as any concerned member of the imperial family might do. She wasn't issuing orders or making official pronouncements. She was merely sharing her thoughts with men who happened to value her wisdom. But the reality was far different. Those who ignored her suggestions found themselves facing investigations, their careers stalling, their families subjected to uncomfortable scrutiny. Those who implemented her recommendations discovered opportunities opening before them, promotions materializing, obstacles mysteriously vanishing. Within months, half of Rome's governing class was effectively reporting to Messalina before they reported to Claudius. Provincial governors would send duplicate dispatches, one to the emperor and another to his wife. Military commanders would seek her approval before implementing new strategies. Even foreign ambassadors began requesting audiences with the empress, recognizing that her favor might prove more valuable than official diplomatic protocols. The transformation was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Rome had never seen anything like it. Even during the Republic, when powerful women like Fulvia or Livia wielded enormous influence, they had operated through male intermediaries, maintaining at least the fiction that authority flowed through proper channels. Messalina had abandoned such pretenses entirely. She was ruling openly, boldly, with a confidence that suggested she believed herself untouchable. But perhaps most remarkably, she was succeeding. The empire didn't collapse under this unprecedented arrangement. Trade continued, taxes were collected, borders remained secure, public works progressed on schedule. If anything, some aspects of governance improved under her dual administration. Messalina possessed an intuitive understanding of human motivation that complemented Claudius's scholarly approach to policy. Where he might spend weeks researching historical precedents for a decision, she could cut through complexity with ruthless pragmatism. Her success, however, created new dangers. Every effective decision she made, every crisis she resolved, every problem she solved more efficiently than traditional channels might have managed, served as evidence that a woman could govern as well as any man. This was revolutionary thinking in a society built on the assumption of male superiority in all matters of public importance. Conservative senators began to whisper among themselves about the dangerous precedent being set. If Claudius's wife could effectively co-rule the empire, what did that mean for their own wives, daughters, and sisters? Were they witnessing the beginning of a new age where women might claim political equality? Or were they seeing an aberration that needed to be corrected before it spread? These concerns might have remained mere grumbling if Messalina had been content to exercise power quietly, efficiently, without drawing unnecessary attention to herself. But contentment had never been part of her nature. Having proven that she could govern effectively, she now wanted recognition for her achievements. She wanted historians to record her contributions. She wanted poets to celebrate her wisdom. She wanted temples erected in her honor, not just as the emperor's wife or the mother of his heir, but as a ruler in her own right. This desire for recognition led her to commission a series of public monuments that would commemorate her role in various imperial achievements. The completion of the Claudian aqueduct, one of Rome's greatest engineering marvels, was marked by inscriptions that mentioned her contributions alongside those of the emperor. New roads built during Claudius's reign bore markers acknowledging her involvement in their planning. Even military victories were celebrated with monuments that credited her strategic insights. To Roman eyes, accustomed to seeing women's names appear in public only as wives, mothers, or daughters of important men, these inscriptions were shocking. Here was a woman claiming credit for achievements typically attributed solely to male rulers. Here was someone asserting that her contributions to the empire deserved permanent recognition, that future generations should remember her not just as Claudius's wife, but as a partner in governance. The psychological effect on Messalina herself was intoxicating. Seeing her name carved in marble, reading poetry that praised her wisdom, hearing crowds cheer when she appeared at public ceremonies, all of this fed a growing sense that she had transcended the normal limitations of her gender and her time. She began to believe that she was creating a new model of female leadership that would inspire women for generations to come. But inspiration can be dangerous when it challenges fundamental social structures. Reports began reaching Rome from the provinces of women, citing Messalina's example to claim greater authority in their own communities. Wives of governors started attending official meetings. Daughters of wealthy merchants began demanding roles in family businesses previously reserved for men. Even among the common people, women started questioning traditional limitations on their activities and ambitions. This social upheaval terrified Rome's male elite more than any military threat or economic crisis. They could understand and respond to conventional challenges, rebellious provinces, barbarian invasions, natural disasters, but a challenge to the basic assumptions about gender roles and social hierarchy struck at the very foundation of their worldview. If women could rule as effectively as men, if traditional limitations were revealed as arbitrary conventions rather than natural law, then what other assumptions might prove equally fragile? The backlash, when it came, would be swift and merciless. But Messalina, intoxicated by her apparent success, blinded by the adulation of her supporters, drunk on the unprecedented power she wielded, failed to recognize the growing storm. She had become so accustomed to bending others to her will that she had forgotten a crucial truth about power. It always creates enemies, and those enemies never stop looking for opportunities to strike back. Narcissus, still quietly documenting every excess, every overreach, every dangerous precedent, watched the empress's growing boldness with calculating patience. He understood that Messalina's very success was creating the conditions for her destruction. Each public monument, each inscription bearing her name, each assertion of authority beyond traditional bounds was providing ammunition for her eventual downfall. The freedman had learned something that Messalina, for all her cunning, had never grasped. In Rome, visibility was vulnerability. The shadows that she had abandoned in her quest for recognition had also provided protection. By stepping into the blazing light of public acknowledgement, she had made herself a target for every enemy, every rival, every traditionalist who yearned for a return to familiar hierarchies. But Messalina's most dangerous enemy wasn't among the senators whispering in dark corners, or the conservatives plotting her downfall. It was her own insatiable appetite for more. Having achieved the impossible, effective co-rule of the Roman Empire, she couldn't resist pushing further, reaching for prizes that would prove beyond even her remarkable abilities to claim safely. The consulship still beckoned, that ultimate symbol of Roman political achievement. Military command called to her, the chance to lead legions in her own name rather than through intermediaries. Even more intoxicating was the possibility of religious authority, of claiming the kind of divine sanction that might make her position truly unassailable. Each of these ambitions represented not just personal advancement, but a fundamental challenge to Roman civilization itself. The consulship had never been held by a woman in 800 years of Roman history. Military command was considered inherently masculine, requiring physical courage and tactical skills that society deemed beyond female capabilities. Religious authority for women was limited to specific cults and ceremonies, never extending to the broad spiritual leadership that emperors claimed. Yet Messalina began to believe that her unprecedented success in governance qualified her for these ultimate prizes. She had already shattered so many barriers, violated so many traditions, achieved so many impossibilities, that the remaining limitations seemed arbitrary. temporary obstacles rather than fundamental principles of Roman life. This growing confidence would lead her to contemplate moves so audacious, so shocking, so completely beyond the bounds of acceptable behavior, that even her most loyal supporters would be forced to choose between their devotion to her and their commitment to Rome itself. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of imperial power, challenge the foundations of Roman society, and ultimately determine whether one woman's extraordinary ambitions could reshape an entire civilization. The empress, who had begun as a teenage bride seeking security, had evolved into something Rome had never seen before. A woman who believed herself capable of claiming any prize, breaking any rule, violating any tradition in pursuit of absolute power. The question that remained was whether Rome itself could survive such unprecedented ambition, or whether the collision between Messalina's desires and Roman tradition would destroy them both. As winter settled over the Eternal City, as senators huddled in their villas discussing the impossible situation that had developed, as Narcissus continued his patient documentation of imperial excess, the empire held its breath. Everyone could sense that something unprecedented was building, that the careful balance between tradition and innovation that had sustained Roman civilization for centuries was about to be tested in ways no one could fully predict. What came next would shock even those who thought they understood the depths of Messalina's ambition, because the empress, who had already achieved the impossible, was about to attempt something that would make her previous achievements seem modest by comparison. The moment that would define everything came not through careful planning or political calculation, but through a single glance across a crowded amphitheatre. Gaius Silius, the most handsome man in Rome, caught Messalina's eye during the gladiatorial games celebrating Claudius's triumph in Britain. He was everything the emperor wasn't: young, athletic, devastatingly beautiful, with the kind of magnetic presence that made crowds turn to stare when he entered a room. But Silius represented far more than mere physical attraction. He was a senator from an ancient patrician family, a man whose bloodline stretched back to the earliest days of the Republic. His grandfather had been a consul, his father a respected general who had died fighting Germanic tribes. In choosing him, Messalina wasn't just selecting a lover, she was claiming the very essence of Roman nobility for herself. The seduction began immediately. Within days of that first meeting, Silius found himself receiving invitations to private dinners at the palace. Messalina deployed every weapon in her considerable arsenal: her beauty, her wit, her power, her promises of advancement. She spoke to him of poetry and philosophy, subjects that revealed an intelligence far beyond what most men expected from even an educated woman. She listened to his political opinions with the kind of focused attention that made him feel like the most important person in the empire. Most intoxicating of all, she shared with him glimpses of the real power she wielded. She showed him correspondence from provincial governors seeking her guidance. She let him witness her private audiences with senators and military commanders. She made him understand that he wasn't just courting the emperor's wife, he was being invited into partnership with the most influential woman in the known world. Silius, despite his noble birth and political experience, was completely unprepared for this level of seduction. Roman women of his acquaintance were either dutiful wives focused on household management or courtesans skilled in physical pleasure, but lacking in political sophistication. Messalina represented something entirely new, a woman who combined devastating sensuality with genuine intellectual engagement and unprecedented political power. Within weeks, he was utterly captivated. Their affair began in the shadows, conducted through carefully orchestrated meetings in private villas, secret rendezvous in gardens owned by Messalina's supporters, stolen moments during public ceremonies where they could exchange meaningful glances while maintaining the facade of casual acquaintance. But secrecy had never satisfied Messalina for long. Having proven that she could seduce Rome's most eligible bachelor, having demonstrated once again her irresistible appeal, She wanted more. She wanted recognition, acknowledgement, the kind of open relationship that would force Roman society to accept her choices regardless of their shock or disapproval. The first sign of her changing attitude came during the Saturnalia festival, Rome's annual celebration of social inversion, where normal rules were temporarily suspended. Messalina appeared at the public festivities with Silius at her side, not as a discreet escort, but as an obvious companion. They shared wine from the same cup, laughed at each other's jokes, exchanged touches that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The reaction was immediate and electric. Romans who had grown accustomed to their empress's unconventional behavior found themselves confronted with something that crossed entirely new lines. Adultery among the elite was common enough, but it was conducted discreetly, with at least a pretense of maintaining proper appearances. Open adultery, flaunted publicly by the emperor's wife, was unprecedented and deeply shocking, but the public display served Messalina's purposes perfectly. By forcing Roman society to confront her relationship with Silius, she was testing their willingness to accept her choices simply because of who she was. Would they condemn her, risking her wrath and potential retaliation? Or would they find ways to rationalize her behavior, proving once again that her power transcended normal social boundaries? The answer revealed the true extent of her influence. While private conversations buzzed with scandal and outrage, public reaction remained muted. Senators, who might have spoken out against any other woman's behavior, found themselves calculating the potential consequences of criticizing the empress. Wealthy citizens who were shocked by her conduct nevertheless sent gifts and invitations, hoping to maintain her favor. Even religious leaders, who should have condemned such flagrant violation of marriage vows, remained diplomatically silent. This acquiescence intoxicated Messalina beyond measure. She had openly violated one of Roman society's most fundamental taboos and faced no meaningful consequences. If she could conduct a public affair with impunity, what other boundaries might prove equally fragile? What other rules might bend before the reality of her power? The relationship with Silius deepened rapidly under these circumstances. No longer confined to stolen moments and secret meetings, they began spending entire days together. Messalina would appear at Senate meetings with Silius in her entourage. They attended theatre performances sitting side by side in the imperial box. They were seen together at religious ceremonies, at public banquets, at gladiatorial contests, presenting themselves as an established couple, despite the inconvenient fact that she remained married to the emperor. Silius himself was transformed by this unprecedented situation. The shy senator, who had initially been overwhelmed by Messalina's attention, evolved into something approaching a co-ruler in his own right. He began offering opinions on imperial policy, making recommendations for appointments, even issuing what amounted to orders to lower-ranking officials who sought to curry favor with the empress's obvious favorite. The psychological dynamic between them became increasingly complex. Messalina had chosen Silius partially because his beauty and noble birth reflected well on her own status. But she discovered that his genuine intelligence and political instincts made him a valuable partner in governance. For the first time in her life, she had found someone who could match her ambition while complementing her skills. Silius, meanwhile, found himself caught between gratitude for Messalina's favor and growing awareness of his precarious position. He understood that his elevation depended entirely on her continued protection. But he also recognized that association with her exposed him to enormous risks. If her power ever faltered, if Claudius ever recognized the true nature of their relationship, if political circumstances shifted against her, he would likely be the first to pay the price. This tension between opportunity and danger created a strange intimacy between them. They were partners in the most audacious political gamble in Roman history, co-conspirators in a plot to redefine the very nature of imperial power. Their relationship transcended mere adultery or even romantic love. They had become collaborators in an attempt to reshape civilization itself. But their growing boldness was creating new enemies every day. Conservative senators who had grudgingly accepted Messalina's political influence found her open adultery impossible to stomach. Military commanders who had worked with her effectively began questioning whether they could serve an emperor whose wife so flagrantly dishonored him. Even among the common people, whispers began circulating about the empress who had forgotten her duties as wife and mother. Most dangerous of all, their behavior was finally penetrating Claudius's scholarly detachment from palace intrigue. The emperor, who had remained oblivious to his wife's political maneuvering and even her previous affairs, could not ignore the increasingly public nature of her relationship with Silius. Reports reached him from too many sources. Descriptions were too detailed. The evidence was too overwhelming for even his trusting nature to dismiss. Narcissus watched these developments with growing excitement. After years of documenting Messalina's excesses, carefully building a case that might someday prove useful, he suddenly found himself holding evidence of behavior so flagrant, so undeniable, so shocking that even Claudius would be forced to act. The Empress's greatest triumph, her ability to conduct an open affair without consequences, might finally provide the weapon needed to destroy her. But Messalina remained oblivious to the gathering storm. Intoxicated by her apparent immunity from consequences, emboldened by Silius's partnership, convinced that her power had transcended all traditional limitations, she prepared to take the step that would define her legacy forever. Because conducting an open affair, shocking as it was, still fell short of her ultimate ambition. She wanted marriage, not a secret ceremony or a private commitment, but a full Roman wedding complete with all the traditional rituals, witnessed by the city's elite, celebrated as a public festival. She wanted to marry Silius while remaining married to Claudius, creating an unprecedented situation that would force Roman law and custom to accommodate her desires. The idea was breathtaking in its audacity. Roman marriage was a sacred institution, governed by centuries of legal tradition and religious ritual. Bigamy was not merely illegal. It was considered an offense against the gods themselves, a violation of divine law that threatened the entire cosmic order. For the emperor's wife to commit such an act would be revolutionary beyond measure. Yet Messalina began planning exactly such a ceremony. She consulted with priests about the necessary rituals, commissioned artists to design decorations, sent invitations to Rome's most important families. She approached the project with the same methodical precision she had applied to her political machinations, treating the impossibility of her goals as merely another obstacle to overcome through careful planning and ruthless execution. Silius initially resisted the idea, understanding better than Messalina the enormous risks involved. An affair, even a public one, might be overlooked or rationalized by a trusting husband. But a wedding ceremony would be impossible to ignore or explain away. It would force a direct confrontation with Claudius, create a crisis that could only end in triumph or total destruction. But Messalina's powers of persuasion proved irresistible. She painted pictures of the life they could build together, ruling Rome as true partners rather than hiding in shadows. She described the precedent they would set for future generations, showing that love and political compatibility mattered more than outdated customs. Most compelling of all, she argued that their marriage would legitimize their relationship in the eyes of the gods, transforming what critics called adultery into a sacred union blessed by divine authority. Under this relentless campaign, Silius's resistance crumbled. His love for Messalina, combined with his growing ambition and his genuine belief in their partnership, overcame his political caution. He agreed to the wedding, sealing his fate and hers in a decision that would echo through Roman history for centuries. The preparations began immediately. Messalina chose a date when Claudius would be away from Rome, visiting the port of Ostia to oversee grain shipments from Egypt. She selected a villa outside the city walls, beautiful and private, but large enough to accommodate the hundreds of guests she planned to invite. She commissioned musicians, dancers, and actors to provide entertainment worthy of an imperial celebration. Most importantly, she began the delicate process of explaining to Rome's elite why they should attend this impossible ceremony. She framed it as a celebration of love transcending conventional boundaries, a demonstration that the imperial family was strong enough to embrace new forms of relationship. She suggested that their presence would mark them as progressive thinkers, allies in creating a more enlightened form of Roman civilization. The responses revealed the true extent of her influence. Despite the shocking nature of what she proposed, despite the obvious legal and religious problems, despite the enormous risks involved in attending such a ceremony, the invitations were largely accepted. Senators who should have refused outright found themselves calculating the political costs of absence. Wealthy citizens who were privately appalled by the idea nevertheless prepared their finest clothes and most expensive gifts. Even more remarkably, Messalina found priests willing to perform the ceremony. Not minor clerics seeking advancement, but respected religious authorities who convinced themselves that the empress's unprecedented position justified unprecedented accommodations. They developed elaborate theological arguments explaining why her marriage to Silius would actually strengthen rather than weaken the divine foundations of Roman society. As the wedding date approached, excitement built throughout the city. This wasn't just a social event, it was a moment of historical significance, a test of whether Roman civilization could adapt to embrace entirely new possibilities. Those invited felt themselves participants in something revolutionary, witnesses to the birth of a new age where traditional limitations no longer applied to those with sufficient power and vision. But in Ostia, as Claudius supervised the mundane business of imperial administration, troubling reports began reaching his ears. Whispers about unusual preparations at a villa outside Rome, strange conversations about wedding ceremonies and religious innovations. Most disturbing of all, suggestions that his wife was planning something that would require his immediate attention upon his return. Narcissus, who had accompanied the emperor to Ostia, finally saw his moment arriving. The evidence he had so carefully compiled, the documentation of years of excess and overreach, the proof of Messalina's systematic violation of every boundary, all of it would soon be needed. Because the empress who believed herself untouchable was about to discover that even her extraordinary power had limits, and that some lines could not be crossed without consequences that no amount of influence could prevent. The wedding that Messalina envisioned as her ultimate triumph would instead become the catalyst for her destruction. The ceremony she planned as a celebration of transcendent love would transform into the stage for a confrontation that would determine not just her fate, but the future direction of the Roman Empire itself. As autumn winds swept across the Seven Hills, as preparations for an impossible wedding reached their climax, as the emperor in Ostia began to understand the true magnitude of what awaited him in Rome, the ancient city held its breath. Everyone sensed that they stood at a crossroads, that the choices made in the coming days would echo through history, determining whether the unprecedented ambitions of one extraordinary woman would reshape civilization, or whether the weight of tradition would crush even the most remarkable individual who dared to challenge it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every assumption about power, gender, tradition, and change in the ancient world. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear, the kind of Roman autumn day that poets would later claim the gods themselves had crafted for momentous occasions. In her private chambers, Messalina woke before sunrise, her mind already racing through the final preparations for what would become the most audacious ceremony in Roman history. Today, she would marry Gaius Silius, while remaining the wife of Emperor Claudius. Today, she would shatter every convention that had governed Roman society for 8 centuries. But 60 miles away in Ostia, another drama was unfolding. Narcissus had finally played his hand, presenting Claudius with documentation so comprehensive, so damning, so irrefutable that even the emperor's legendary capacity for denial crumbled in the face of overwhelming evidence. The freedman had waited years for this moment, carefully building his case. And now he watched as understanding dawned across Claudius's scholarly features. The emperor's reaction was not the explosive rage that Narcissus had expected. Instead, Claudius seemed to age a decade in moments, his shoulders sagging as he absorbed the reality of what his beloved wife had become. The man who could recite complex legal precedents from memory, who could debate the finer points of historical interpretation for hours, found himself speechless in the face of personal betrayal so complete it defied comprehension. What hurt most wasn't the adultery itself. Roman marriages among the elite often accommodated such arrangements with discreet understanding. What devastated Claudius was the systematic nature of Messalina's deception, the way she had weaponized his trust, turned his love into a tool for her own advancement. Every tender moment they had shared, every political decision she had influenced, every assurance of loyalty she had offered, now appeared in a new and terrible light. Narcissus, recognizing the emperor's shock, pressed his advantage with clinical precision. He produced letters proving Messalina's role in political executions. He showed evidence of her shadow government, complete with records of the appointments she had made and the policies she had implemented without imperial authorization. Most damning of all, he presented testimonies from witnesses who had seen her with Silius, descriptions so detailed and consistent that denial became impossible. But the freedman's masterstroke was revealing the wedding plans. This wasn't merely about adultery or even unauthorized governance. This was treason on an unprecedented scale. By marrying another man while remaining empress, Messalina was attempting to create a dual imperial household, effectively splitting the monarchy itself. The legal implications were staggering, the precedent terrifying, the threat to imperial stability absolute. As Claudius absorbed this information, his shock began transforming into something far more dangerous, cold, calculating fury. The gentle scholar who had preferred books to battles, who had ascended to the throne almost by accident, suddenly revealed the steel that had kept him alive through decades of palace intrigue. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried an authority that even Narcissus had never heard before. The orders came rapid fire, each one precise and final. Trusted centurions were summoned and given sealed instructions. Messages were dispatched to Rome with unprecedented urgency. Most crucially, the Praetorian Guard units still loyal to the emperor rather than his wife were quietly alerted and positioned for what was to come. Claudius had learned statecraft from watching Augustus, Tiberius, and even Caligula. He understood that decisive action, once begun, must be completed without hesitation. Meanwhile, in Rome, the wedding preparations reached their crescendo in an atmosphere of fevered excitement and barely suppressed terror. Everyone involved understood they were participating in something revolutionary, but few had fully grasped the enormous risks they were assuming. The guest list read like a catalogue of Rome's most powerful families, each name representing not just an individual, but entire networks of political and economic influence. Messalina herself moved through the preparations with an almost supernatural calm. She had crossed so many boundaries, violated so many taboos, achieved so many impossibilities, that this final transgression felt almost inevitable. The teenage bride who had once trembled at the thought of displeasing her elderly husband had evolved into a woman who believed herself capable of rewriting the fundamental laws of Roman civilization. The ceremony itself was planned with meticulous attention to every traditional detail. Messalina would wear the flame-colored veil of a Roman bride, carry the ritual torch, speak the ancient vows that had sanctified marriages for generations beyond memory. The irony was deliberate. By conducting the most transgressive act in Roman history through the most traditional forms, she was forcing society to confront the arbitrary nature of its own rules. Silius, resplendent in senatorial white bordered with purple, had overcome his final reservations. Standing beside Messalina as she reviewed the final arrangements, he seemed transformed by the magnitude of what they were attempting. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a revolution disguised as a celebration, a complete overthrow of established order presented as a festival of love. The guests began arriving at the villa before noon, each entrance carefully choreographed to demonstrate the breadth of support for this unprecedented union. Senators came with their wives and children, making the gathering a family affair that suggested normalcy and acceptance. Wealthy merchants brought gifts that rivaled those offered at imperial ceremonies. Even representatives from the major religious colleges attended, lending an aura of divine sanction to the proceedings. But beneath the festive atmosphere, tension crackled like electricity before a storm. Conversations were punctuated by nervous laughter. Glances darted constantly toward the horizon, as if expecting some divine intervention to prevent what everyone knew was impossible. The very audacity of what they were witnessing created a strange mixture of exhilaration and dread that left many guests feeling simultaneously privileged and doomed. The religious ceremonies began with traditional sacrifices to ensure divine favor for the union. The priests, having convinced themselves that their presence served the greater good of Roman stability, performed their duties with elaborate precision. Every ritual was executed perfectly, every prayer offered with proper solemnity, every sacred formula recited without error. If the gods objected to this impossible marriage, they would have to make their disapproval known through more dramatic means. As the afternoon wore on, the celebration took on an almost dreamlike quality. Music filled the autumn air. Dancers performed ancient fertility rituals. Poets recited verses celebrating the triumph of love over convention. Wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions until guests began speaking openly about the revolutionary implications of what they were witnessing. Some proclaimed this, the dawn of a new age, where women would claim their rightful place as partners in governance rather than silent supporters. Others argued that Messalina's example would inspire similar transformations throughout the empire, creating a more enlightened form of Roman civilization. A few whispered that they were witnessing the birth of a dynasty that would combine the best elements of imperial authority with the passion and intelligence of its most remarkable empress. But even as the celebration reached its peak, darker currents moved beneath the surface. Servants brought whispered reports from the city that made the more politically astute guests uneasy. There were rumors of unusual military movements, suggestions that certain Praetorian units had been placed on alert, hints that messages had been sent to Ostia with unprecedented urgency. The most experienced courtiers began making discreet inquiries about alternate routes home, just in case the festivities ended more abruptly than planned. Messalina herself seemed oblivious to these undercurrents of concern. She moved through the gathering like a queen holding court, accepting congratulations and praise with the gracious confidence of someone whose victory was complete and unassailable. When guests approached with barely concealed anxiety to ask about potential consequences, she laughed off their concerns with assurances that her position was unshakable, her influence absolute. The actual wedding ceremony began as the sun started its descent toward the western hills, bathing the villa in golden light that seemed almost divine in its beauty. Messalina and Cilia stood before the assembled crowd, surrounded by flowers and incense, flanked by musicians, a platform that and dancers elevated on everyone to witness this unprecedented moment in Roman history. The priest's voice carried clearly across the grounds as he began the ancient formula that had united Roman couples since the earliest days of the Republic. The words were familiar, sacred, unchanged by centuries of repetition, yet spoken now in circumstances so extraordinary that they seemed to acquire entirely new meaning. When he asked if the bride came willingly to this union, Messalina's response rang out with such conviction that several guests gasped at the implications. The exchange of vows, followed traditional patterns that everyone present had witnessed countless times before, but the context transformed even the most conventional phrases into revolutionary statements. When Silius promised to cherish and protect his bride, he was essentially claiming authority over the emperor's wife. When Messalina vowed to honor and obey her new husband, she was publicly transferring loyalties that should have belonged exclusively to Claudius. The moment of greatest audacity came when the couple shared the ritual cake, symbolizing their union in the eyes of gods and mortals alike. This simple act, performed at countless Roman weddings throughout history, now represented the most direct challenge to imperial authority ever attempted. By accepting cake from Silius's hand, Messalina was formally acknowledging him as her husband, while remaining legally married to the emperor. The guests erupted in cheers and applause that could be heard for miles around Rome. This wasn't merely enthusiasm for the couple's happiness, it was celebration of their own participation in history, their presence at the moment when Roman civilization proved flexible enough to embrace revolutionary change. They had witnessed the impossible and emerged not as criminals, but as pioneers of a new age. But even as the celebration reached its crescendo, riders were already thundering along the coastal road from Ostia, carrying orders that would transform triumph into tragedy within hours. Claudius, having overcome his initial shock, was moving with the decisive authority of a man who understood that hesitation meant death, his own or his wife's, but certainly one of them. The emperor's response revealed strategic thinking that surprised even Narcissus. Rather than rushing back to Rome in visible fury, Claudius maintained the pretense of normal business while his agents moved into position. He understood that open confrontation with Messalina on equal terms might result in civil war, given her extensive network of supporters and the genuine affection many Romans felt for her. Instead, he chose to strike when she was most vulnerable, at the moment of her greatest triumph, surrounded by witnesses to her transgression, caught in an act so flagrant that even her most loyal supporters would find it impossible to defend. The wedding she intended as proof of her invincibility would become evidence for her prosecution. The guests she gathered as supporters would transform into witnesses for her condemnation. The trap was sprung with military precision, as sunset painted the Roman hills in shades of gold and crimson. As the wedding feast reached new heights of celebration, as Messalina and Silius basked in the adulation of their guests, Praetorian forces surrounded the villa with silent efficiency. The party continued for precious minutes more, unaware that their world was about to collapse around them. The first sign of trouble came when servants began disappearing from their duties, called away by urgent messages they couldn't explain. Then musicians stopped playing mid-song, distracted by sounds from outside that didn't belong to any celebration. Finally, a guest near the villa's entrance noticed armed figures moving through the gardens with the purposeful stride of men carrying out official orders. The transformation from celebration to catastrophe happened with breathtaking speed. One moment, the assembled crowd was toasting the success of the most audacious wedding in Roman history. The next, they found themselves facing Praetorian centurions whose presence could mean only one thing. The emperor knew everything, and retribution was at hand. Messalina's reaction revealed both her remarkable composure and her fatal miscalculation of her own position. Even faced with armed soldiers carrying imperial orders, she maintained the regal bearing that had carried her through so many previous crises. She demanded to know by what authority they dared interrupt a private ceremony, insisting that her status as empress protected both herself and her guests from arbitrary interference. But the centurion's response shattered her illusions with brutal clarity. He carried sealed orders bearing Claudius's personal seal, commands that superseded any authority she might claim. The emperor had spoken, and his word was law, even for the wife who had believed herself beyond the reach of consequences. The arrest was conducted with the respect due to her imperial status, but its implications were unmistakable. As Praetorian guards escorted Messalina from the villa, as her guests scattered in terror, As the wedding feast was abandoned to servants and scavenging birds, the most powerful woman in Rome discovered that power, built on deception and maintained through fear, had limits that even she could not transcend. Silius, watching his bride disappear into imperial custody, faced a choice that would define his final hours. He could attempt to escape, hoping his family connections and senatorial status might provide some protection. He could throw himself on Claudius's mercy, pleading ignorance of the full implications of his actions. Or he could accept responsibility for his choices with the dignity expected of a Roman nobleman facing inevitable death. His decision revealed the character that had attracted Messalina in the first place. Rather than fleeing or grovelling, Silius requested permission to return to Rome under guard, asking only that he be allowed to face his fate with honour intact. The centurion, recognizing courage even in a condemned man, granted this final request with the professional respect that soldiers accorded to worthy opponents. The journey back to the city became a funeral procession for the dreams and ambitions that had driven both conspirators to their ultimate transgression. The villa that had witnessed the most audacious wedding in Roman history stood empty as darkness fell, its decorations mocking reminders of hopes that had soared too high and fallen too far. As news of the arrests spread through Rome's neighborhoods, citizens gathered in small groups to discuss the implications of what had happened. Some expressed relief that the impossible situation had finally been resolved, that proper order would be restored to the imperial household. Others mourned the destruction of a woman whose intelligence and charisma had genuinely impressed them, regardless of her transgressions. But perhaps most significantly, many Romans found themselves questioning assumptions they had never examined before. If someone as powerful as Messalina could fall so completely, what did that say about the nature of authority itself? If traditions could be violated so flagrantly, yet ultimately reassert themselves with deadly force, what was the true relationship between innovation and stability in their civilization? These questions would outlive both Messalina and her accusers, becoming part of the intellectual legacy of an empire that constantly struggled to balance respect for tradition with the need for adaptation. The wedding that was meant to celebrate the triumph of individual will over social convention had instead demonstrated the enormous cost of challenging fundamental structures without sufficient support or careful planning. In his residence near the Forum, Narcissus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as he received confirmation that both primary conspirators were in custody. Years of patient documentation, careful investigation, and strategic waiting had finally yielded the decisive moment he had long anticipated. But even in triumph, Messalina was only the beginning of a larger. The freedman understood that removing challenge, the network of supporters, collaborators, and beneficiaries that the Empress had built over her years in power remained largely intact. Her execution would eliminate the central figure, but not the system of relationships and obligations she had created. Cleaning up the political aftermath of her reign would require the same methodical approach that had brought about her downfall, the same careful attention to detail that had made her destruction possible. More immediately, there was the question of how to handle the hundreds of wedding guests who had witnessed and participated in the treasonous ceremony. Many were among Rome's most prominent citizens, people whose destruction would destabilize the very foundations of imperial society. Yet their presence at the wedding made them complicit in Messalina's ultimate transgression, creating a legal and political dilemma that would test Claudius's judgment and mercy. The emperor himself, still travelling back to Rome through the autumn night, grappled with emotions and decisions that would have challenged any leader. The personal betrayal cut deep, but the political implications demanded responses that transcended private hurt. He had acted decisively to prevent immediate catastrophe, but the harder task of rebuilding trust and stability in the imperial system still lay ahead. As the first light of dawn broke over the 7 hills, as citizens emerged from their homes to discover how completely their world had changed overnight, as the machinery of imperial justice prepared for trials that would determine the fate of dozens of Rome's elite, the Eternal City began another chapter in its long history of adapting to crisis and change. The woman who had challenged every convention, violated every boundary, and ultimately attempted to reshape Roman civilization itself was now just another prisoner awaiting judgment. Had raised about power and, but the questions her lifed gender, tradition and innovation, individual ambition and social stability would echo through the corridors of history long after her voice had been silenced forever. The stage was set for a reckoning that would test not just the fate of specific individuals, but the resilience of the imperial system itself when faced with challenges that no previous generation of Romans had ever imagined possible. The dawn that broke over Rome on October 16th brought with it a silence more terrifying than any storm. Citizens who ventured into the streets found a city transformed overnight, where whispered conversations replaced the usual morning bustle, where glances were exchanged with the careful calculation of people navigating a minefield they couldn't see but knew was there. The news had spread through the neighborhoods like smoke through narrow alleys. Messalina, the woman who had seemed untouchable just hours before, sat in a cell beneath the Palatine Hill. Her lover, the senator whose beauty had captivated Rome's most powerful woman, waited in chains for a judgment that everyone knew would be final. The impossible had happened, and now the city held its collective breath, waiting to see how far the consequences would spread. But perhaps most unsettling of all was what hadn't happened. The empire continued to function. Grain shipments arrived from Egypt on schedule. Tax collectors went about their business. Soldiers manned their posts along distant frontiers, unaware that the woman who had effectively co-ruled their world for years was now counting her final hours. The machinery of Roman governance, so dependent on Messalina's shadow administration, proved remarkably resilient when suddenly deprived of her guiding hand. This continuity revealed something profound about the nature of imperial power that even Messalina, for all her political acumen, had failed to grasp. The empire wasn't held together by any single individual's brilliance or charisma. It was sustained by thousands of administrators, soldiers, and citizens who understood their roles and performed them regardless of who occupied the palace. Her removal, shocking as it was, created ripples rather than collapse, disruption rather than destruction. In the imperial chambers, Claudius faced decisions that would define not just his remaining years as emperor, but his place in Roman history. The man who had ascended to power almost by accident now found himself wielding that power with a precision that surprised even his closest advisors. The gentle scholar had revealed depths of resolve that transformed him from a figure of mild ridicule into something approaching genuine authority. His first challenge was immediate and practical: what to do with the hundreds of witnesses to Messalina's wedding ceremony. The guest list included senators whose support was crucial for governing effectively, wealthy merchants whose economic influence shaped entire provinces, and religious leaders whose spiritual authority maintained social stability. Executing them all would devastate Roman society. Pardoning them completely would make a mockery of Roman law. Some middle path had to be found, a solution that demonstrated both justice and mercy in carefully calibrated measure. The emperor's approach revealed political sophistication that few had credited him with possessing. Rather than mass executions or blanket pardons, he began a methodical process of individual evaluation. Each guest's level of involvement was assessed, their motivations examined, their value to the empire weighed against their complicity in treason. Some faced exile, others paid substantial fines. A few received warnings that would shadow their remaining careers. The most deeply involved faced death. But even these sentences were carried out with dignity rather than the brutal spectacle that had marked previous imperial purges. This measured response sent a powerful message throughout Roman society. Claudius wasn't acting from personal vindictiveness or uncontrolled rage. He was restoring order through justice, demonstrating that even imperial mercy operated within the boundaries of law rather than arbitrary whim. The contrast with his predecessor Caligula's chaotic brutality could not have been more stark or more reassuring to Romans who had lived through those terrible years. But the emperor's most difficult decision concerned Messalina herself. Roman law was clear about the penalty for treason, and her actions at the wedding ceremony had crossed every possible line of acceptable behavior. Yet she remained the mother of his son, the woman he had loved with genuine devotion, the partner who had shared his bed and his secrets for years. Personal affection warred with political necessity in ways that kept him wakeful through the dark hours before dawn. The legal proceedings that followed would become models for imperial justice, studied by jurists for generations. Every precedent was carefully examined, every principle of Roman law meticulously applied, every decision documented with the thoroughness that Claudius brought to all his scholarly endeavours. This wasn't a show trial designed to justify predetermined conclusions. It was a genuine attempt to apply Roman legal traditions to circumstances that no previous generation had ever imagined. Messalina's defense, such as it was, relied on arguments that revealed both her desperation and her continued failure to understand the gravity of her situation. Her advocates claimed that the wedding ceremony had been a symbolic gesture rather than a legal marriage, a celebration of friendship that had been misinterpreted by hostile observers. They argued that her previous service to the empire, her successful governance during Claudius's absences, her role as mother to the imperial heir, all deserved consideration in determining her fate. But the evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses numerous, the implications undeniable. The documentation that Narcissus had compiled over years of careful observation painted a picture of systematic deception and escalating transgression that made denial impossible. Most damning of all was Messalina's own behaviour at the wedding, her obvious joy in the ceremony, her public acknowledgement of Silius as her husband while remaining married to the emperor. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Messalina herself was brought before the court. Even in chains, even facing certain death, she retained the bearing that had made her the most compelling woman in Rome. Her beauty remained undiminished, her intelligence undimmed, her charisma still powerful enough to make even her accusers pause and consider the magnitude of what they were destroying. She spoke in her own defense with eloquence that reminded everyone present why she had wielded such influence for so many years. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command, the passion of someone fighting for her life, the desperation of someone who finally understood that her remarkable run of success had reached its end. She didn't deny the facts of her case, but attempted to reframe them, to present her actions as service to Rome rather than betrayal of it. Her argument was sophisticated, almost compelling in its audacity. She claimed that her marriage to Silius had been motivated by political necessity rather than personal desire. Claudius was aging, she argued, and the succession needed to be secured through alliances that would ensure stability after his death. Her relationship with Silius represented an attempt to bind the old senatorial families to the imperial cause, creating unity through marriage rather than division through suspicion. Furthermore, she contended that her administrative activities during Claudius's absences had been essential for maintaining imperial effectiveness. The empire was too vast, too complex for any single ruler to manage effectively. Her shadow government had filled crucial gaps, resolved important disputes, maintained stability in ways that formal channels could not have achieved. Rather than usurping authority, she had been exercising it on behalf of an emperor too busy with other responsibilities to handle every detail personally. Most provocatively, she suggested that her actions had actually strengthened rather than weakened imperial power. By demonstrating that capable women could contribute to governance, by showing that marriage alliances could serve political purposes, by proving that unconventional approaches could yield effective results, she had expanded the toolkit available to future emperors. Her innovations, rather than threatening traditional structures, had enhanced them by revealing new possibilities for imperial administration. The courtroom listened in fascination to arguments that challenged basic assumptions about gender, power, and imperial authority. Even those who condemned her actions had to acknowledge the intelligence behind them, the strategic thinking that had guided her choices, the genuine achievements that complicated any simple narrative of treachery and excess. This wasn't a common criminal motivated by greed or spite. This was a political innovator whose vision had exceeded the boundaries that Roman society was prepared to accept. But eloquence couldn't overcome evidence, and vision couldn't excuse treason. The court's verdict was never in doubt, though the reasoning behind it revealed important principles about the limits of imperial power and the requirements of Roman law. Messalina's fate was sealed not just by her actions, but by the precedent that those actions would set if allowed to stand unpunished. The judges emphasized that Roman marriage was a sacred institution that couldn't be redefined to accommodate political convenience or personal preference. The emperor's household served as a model for all Roman families, and corruption at the imperial level threatened the moral foundations of the entire empire. Most crucially, the concentration of power in any single individual, regardless of their capabilities or intentions, violated the balance of authorities that had sustained Roman civilization for centuries. These principles transcended personal considerations or even political expediency. They reflected deep convictions about the nature of Roman society, the relationship between individual ambition and collective welfare, the boundaries that even the most powerful people could not cross without destroying the system that had elevated them. Messalina's punishment would serve not just as retribution for her specific crimes, but as a warning to future generations about the consequences of exceeding those boundaries. The sentence, when it came, surprised no one who understood Roman law, but its implementation revealed Claudius's continued struggle between justice and mercy. Death was inevitable, but the emperor granted his wife the dignity of choosing her manner of departure. She could face execution with the courage expected of a Roman noble, or she could take her own life in privacy, sparing herself and her family the public spectacle of imperial retribution. This final gesture of consideration reflected the complex emotions that continued to war within Claudius. He could condemn her actions while still remembering the woman he had loved. He could uphold Roman law while acknowledging the genuine feelings that had once bound them together. Most importantly, he could demonstrate that imperial justice operated through principle rather than personal vindictiveness, that even the most serious crimes could be punished with dignity intact. Messalina's response to this offer revealed the character that had driven her extraordinary rise and precipitated her catastrophic fall. She rejected the opportunity for private suicide, choosing instead to face death publicly, defiantly, in a manner that would force Rome to confront the full implications of what they were destroying. Even in defeat, she sought to control the narrative, to shape how her story would be remembered and interpreted by future generations. Her final hours were spent not in lamentation or regret, but in careful preparation for a death that would serve as her ultimate political statement. She composed letters to be delivered after her execution, messages that would ensure her version of events reached sympathetic audiences throughout the empire. She arranged for the care of servants who had been loyal during her years in power, demonstrating the personal qualities that had inspired such devotion among those who knew her best. Most significantly, she spent time with her children, particularly Britannicus, the son whose birth had elevated her to unprecedented heights of influence. These conversations, conducted under guard in the shadow of approaching death, represented her attempt to shape how the next generation of the imperial family would understand her legacy. She wanted them to see her not as a criminal who had betrayed their father, but as a woman who had dared to envision new possibilities for Roman civilization. The execution itself, when it finally came, was conducted with the formal precision that marked all imperial ceremonies. Messalina faced her fate with composure that impressed even her enemies, speaking final words that would be debated by historians for centuries to come. She died as she had lived her final years, boldly, dramatically, in a manner designed to force observers to confront uncomfortable questions about power, gender, and the nature of Roman society itself. Her death marked the end of the most extraordinary political career in Roman history, but it also marked the beginning of a different kind of influence. The questions she had raised, the boundaries she had challenged, the precedents she had set, all survived her physical destruction. Future empresses would remember her example, both as inspiration and warning. Future emperors would grapple with the administrative innovations she had pioneered. Future historians would struggle to separate the woman from the legend, the achievements from the crimes, the revolutionary vision from the tragic overreach. In the immediate aftermath of her execution, Rome experienced a strange mixture of relief and loss. The impossible situation that had developed during her final years was resolved, but the resolution came at the cost of destroying someone whose intelligence, charisma, and political skills had genuinely impressed those who observed them firsthand. The empire was safer without her, but it was also diminished by her absence, deprived of a voice that had articulated possibilities most Romans had never imagined. Claudius himself, having demonstrated the resolve necessary to eliminate the greatest threat to his reign, now faced the equally challenging task of rebuilding trust and stability in the imperial system. The network of relationships, obligations, and innovations that Messalina had created couldn't simply be dismantled overnight. Many of her administrative reforms had proved effective and would need to be continued under different leadership. Many of her supporters retained their positions and would need to be managed carefully to prevent future conspiracies. Most importantly, the emperor had to address the broader questions that his wife's career had raised about the nature of imperial power itself. Her success in exercising authority, even through unofficial channels, had demonstrated both the potential for expanding imperial effectiveness and the dangers of concentrating too much influence in any single individual. Future arrangements would need to balance these considerations, creating systems that could benefit from capable advisors, while preventing the emergence of another shadow government. The solutions that emerged from this period of reconstruction would influence Roman imperial administration for generations. New protocols were established for managing imperial correspondence and appointments. Formal roles were created for imperial family members that provided meaningful responsibilities while maintaining clear boundaries. Most significantly, systems of oversight and accountability were strengthened to ensure that no future empress could accumulate the kind of unchecked influence that had made Messalina so dangerous. These institutional changes represented Claudius's most important legacy, more significant even than his military conquests or public works projects. By learning from the crisis that had nearly destroyed his reign, by adapting imperial structures to address weaknesses that Messalina had exploited, he created a more resilient form of government that could better withstand future challenges. The woman who had threatened to tear down the imperial system had ultimately contributed to making it stronger, though at the cost of her own life and the lives of everyone who had followed her too far into uncharted territory. As autumn deepened into winter, as Rome adjusted to the absence of its most compelling and controversial figure, as the machinery of imperial government continued its eternal work of maintaining order across a vast and diverse empire, the city began to process the extraordinary events that had shaken its foundations. The story of Messalina would become legend, retold and reinterpreted by each generation, according to their own understanding of power, ambition, and the eternal tension between individual desire and collective responsibility. But for now, in those quiet months following her death, Rome simply tried to understand what had happened and what it meant for the future. The woman who had challenged every assumption about what was possible had been defeated, but the questions she had raised remained unanswered, waiting for future generations to grapple with the eternal dilemmas of leadership, innovation, and the price of pushing boundaries too far, too fast, in a world not ready for such revolutionary change. The months that followed Messalina's execution revealed something remarkable about the nature of power in ancient Rome. While the empress was gone, the systems she had influenced continued to function. But now they operated with a strange emptiness at their center, like a musical ensemble missing its lead performer. The administrative innovations she had pioneered didn't simply vanish with her death. They had become too useful, too embedded in the daily operations of imperial government to abandon entirely. Claudius found himself in the peculiar position of having to manage the legacy of someone whose actions had nearly destroyed him. The shadow government Messalina had created couldn't be dismantled overnight without causing chaos. Yet allowing it to continue unchanged would risk creating another power center that might challenge imperial authority. The solution required a delicate balance between preserving what worked while ensuring no single individual could again accumulate such dangerous influence. The emperor's approach revealed political wisdom that surprised even his closest advisors. Rather than destroying Messalina's innovations entirely, he began a systematic process of institutionalizing them. The informal networks she had used to gather information became official intelligence services. The personal relationships she had cultivated with provincial governors were transformed into formal diplomatic channels. Most importantly, the administrative efficiency she had brought to imperial decision-making was preserved through new bureaucratic structures that distributed responsibility among multiple officials rather than concentrating it in any single person. This transformation process took months to complete and required navigating countless political sensitivities. Many of Messalina's former associates remained in positions of influence, their loyalties uncertain, their knowledge of imperial secrets making them both valuable and dangerous. Some had genuinely supported her vision of expanded female participation in governance. Others had simply recognized her power and acted accordingly. A few had been coerced into cooperation through threats or blackmail. Each case required individual assessment and careful handling to prevent the emergence of organized resistance to the new arrangements. Perhaps most challenging was the question of how to handle the precedents Messalina had established. Her public appearances at Senate meetings, her involvement in military planning, her role in judicial decisions, all of these activities had created expectations about imperial family participation in governance that couldn't simply be ignored. Future empresses would naturally compare their roles to hers, potentially creating pressure for similar levels of involvement that might prove equally destabilizing. The solution Claudius developed was characteristically scholarly in its attention to historical precedent and legal principle. He commissioned a comprehensive review of Roman traditions regarding women's roles in public life, seeking examples from the Republic and early Empire that might provide guidance for future arrangements. This research revealed that Roman history actually contained numerous instances of women exercising significant political influence, but almost always through established channels and recognized relationships, rather than the shadow operations Messalina had preferred. Using these historical examples, Claudius began creating formal roles for imperial women that would channel their ambitions and abilities in constructive directions, while preventing the accumulation of unchecked power. The empress would have official responsibilities for certain aspects of palace administration, charitable activities, and diplomatic reception of foreign dignitaries. These duties carried real authority, but operated within clearly defined boundaries that prevented expansion into areas reserved for the emperor himself. More significantly, these new arrangements included oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future abuses. Imperial family members would be required to report their activities to designated officials. Financial transactions above certain amounts needed imperial approval. Most importantly, any attempt to establish independent communication channels with provincial governors or military commanders would be considered treasonous by definition, removing the ambiguity that Messalina had exploited so effectively. The implementation of these reforms required extraordinary tact, as they affected not just the imperial family, but the entire Roman elite who had become accustomed to Messalina's unconventional approach to governance. Senators who had grown used to receiving guidance from the empress suddenly found themselves dealing exclusively with imperial freedmen and official secretaries. Wealthy citizens who had cultivated relationships with her inner circle discovered that their carefully built networks of influence had become worthless overnight. This disruption created opportunities for new players to emerge in Roman politics. Individuals who had been excluded from Messalina's circles but possessed the skills and ambition to serve the imperial administration effectively. Claudius proved remarkably adept at identifying and promoting such talent, gradually building a new governing coalition that owed its advancement to him personally, rather than to his deceased wife's patronage. The process wasn't without its casualties. Some of Messalina's most committed supporters found themselves unable to adapt to the new arrangements, their careers ending in disgrace or exile. Others attempted to maintain underground networks of communication and influence, only to discover that the emperor's new security measures were far more comprehensive than they had anticipated. A few made desperate attempts to flee the empire entirely, seeking refuge in client kingdoms or barbarian territories beyond Roman reach. But perhaps most tragic were those who had genuinely believed in Messalina's vision of a more inclusive form of Roman governance. Women particularly who had seen in her example the possibility of meaningful participation in public life. Her fall didn't just eliminate a powerful individual, it discredited an entire approach to gender relations that had begun to gain acceptance among progressive elements of Roman society. The backlash was swift and comprehensive, with traditional voices using her fate as evidence that women's involvement in politics inevitably led to corruption and chaos. This conservative reaction extended far beyond the imperial palace by Messalina's example too, affecting women throughout the empire who had been inspired to claim greater authority in their own communities. Wives of provincial governors found their unofficial advisory roles questioned and constrained. Wealthy women who had begun involving themselves in business decisions discovered renewed resistance from male relatives and partners. Even in the most private domestic settings, the balance of power between husbands and wives shifted back toward traditional patterns, as men cited imperial precedent to justify reasserting their authority. The irony was profound and painful. Messalina's attempt to expand opportunities for women had ultimately resulted in their constriction. Her dramatic rise and fall had provided ammunition for those who argued that female ambition was inherently dangerous, that traditional limitations existed for sound reasons, that innovation in gender relations threatened the stability of civilization itself. The very boldness that had made her extraordinary also made her example toxic for other women seeking more modest advances in their own lives. Yet even as the immediate backlash constrained women's opportunities, Messalina's legacy continued to influence Roman thought in subtler ways. The administrative innovations she had pioneered proved so effective that they couldn't be abandoned entirely. The intelligence network she had created continued to provide valuable information about potential threats to imperial security. Most importantly, the precedent she had established for imperial family involvement in governance, even within newly defined limits, created opportunities that future empresses would gradually expand through careful precedent and patient advocacy. The process of rebuilding imperial administration also revealed the extent to which Messalina's influence had shaped Roman governance during her years of power. Documents discovered after her death showed that she had been involved in far more decisions than even her critics had realized. Provincial appointments, military promotions, judicial verdicts, economic policies, all bore traces of her involvement. Suggestions she had made, modifications she had proposed, alternatives she had recommended. This documentation created both problems and opportunities for Claudius. On one hand, it provided evidence of how thoroughly his authority had been compromised, how many supposedly imperial decisions had actually originated with his wife. On the other hand, it offered insights into governance approaches that had proved effective, innovations that could be preserved even as their original author was condemned. The challenge was separating useful policies from their tainted source, maintaining what worked while rejecting what was dangerous. The emperor's solution was to conduct what amounted to a comprehensive audit of his own reign, examining every major decision made during Messalina's years of influence to determine which should be continued, modified, or reversed entirely. This process took months and required the involvement of hundreds of officials who had to navigate the delicate task of criticizing policies they had previously implemented, while avoiding any suggestion that they had been complicit in treasonous activities. The results of this audit revealed the complexity of Messalina's impact on Roman governance. Many of her suggestions had indeed improved imperial efficiency and effectiveness. Her emphasis on gathering detailed information before making decisions had prevented several potential military disasters. Her attention to provincial concerns had helped maintain stability in regions that might otherwise have erupted in rebellion. Her focus on economic development had contributed to the prosperity that marked much of Claudius's reign. But interwoven with these genuine achievements were policies that served her personal interests rather than imperial welfare. Appointments that strengthened her network of supporters rather than advancing qualified candidates. Legal decisions that eliminated personal enemies rather than serving justice. Economic arrangements that enriched her associates while imposing costs on the broader population. The challenge was identifying and reversing these self-serving elements while preserving the legitimate innovations that had benefited the empire. This sorting process required not just administrative skill, but considerable political courage. Many of the policies that needed reversal had created powerful beneficiaries who would resist change. Some of the officials who had implemented problematic decisions remained in positions where they could obstruct reform efforts. Most challenging of all, some policies had produced mixed results, combining genuine benefits with problematic side effects that made simple judgments impossible. The emperor's approach to these complexities demonstrated the analytical skills that had made him an effective scholar before his unexpected elevation to imperial power. He established review committees that examined each policy area systematically, gathering testimony from all affected parties, analyzing results against stated objectives, comparing outcomes with alternative approaches that might have been pursued. The process was methodical, thorough, and designed to reach conclusions based on evidence rather than political convenience or personal prejudice. But even the most careful analysis couldn't eliminate the political dimensions of these decisions. Every policy change created winners and losers. Every reform generated support from some quarters and opposition from others. Claudius found himself navigating factional conflicts that had been suppressed during Messalina's dominance, but now emerged with renewed intensity as different groups competed to shape the post-Messalina imperial system. The resolution of these conflicts required all the diplomatic skills Claudius could muster. Along with some he had to develop through trial and error. He learned to build coalitions that could support necessary changes, while minimizing organized resistance. He discovered the importance of timing, introducing controversial reforms when political circumstances were most favorable, and delaying others until opposition could be reduced through negotiation or compromise. Most importantly, he developed the ability to frame policy changes in terms of returning to traditional Roman values, rather than rejecting his wife's innovations, making reform seem conservative rather than radical. This rhetorical strategy proved crucial for maintaining stability during the transition period. By emphasizing continuity with Republican traditions and early imperial precedents, Claudius could implement significant changes while avoiding the appearance of dramatic policy reversals that might have suggested weakness or uncertainty. The emperor, who had been mocked for his scholarly interests, now found those very qualities essential for legitimizing necessary reforms through careful attention to historical precedent and legal principle. The success of this approach gradually restored confidence in imperial governance among Romans who had been unsettled by the unprecedented arrangements of Messalina's era. Traditional senators appreciated the return to more familiar procedures and relationships. Provincial administrators welcomed clarified authority structures that eliminated the confusion created by competing power centers. Even common citizens benefited from improved consistency in policy implementation, as the informal networks that had sometimes subverted official decisions were replaced by more predictable institutional arrangements. But perhaps most significantly, the careful manner in which these transitions were managed helped prevent the kind of violent upheaval that had often accompanied major political changes in Roman history. By preserving what worked while reforming what was problematic, by respecting legitimate interests while eliminating abusive practices, by maintaining stability while implementing necessary changes, Claudius demonstrated that even dramatic political crises could be resolved through patient, methodical governance rather than purges and executions. This example would influence Roman imperial practice for generations, establishing precedents for managing transitions that future emperors would adapt to their own circumstances. The institutional arrangements developed during this period created more resilient systems of governance that could better withstand future challenges while maintaining the flexibility needed to respond to changing conditions throughout the vast Roman Empire. As winter gave way to spring, as the immediate crisis of Messalina's fall receded into memory, as new patterns of imperial administration became established routine, Rome began to process the deeper implications of what had occurred. The woman who had challenged every assumption about female capability and imperial authority was gone, but the questions she had raised about power, gender, and governance would continue to influence Roman thought for centuries to come. Her story became a cautionary tale told to young women about the dangers of ambition unchecked by wisdom, but it also served as proof that women could excel in political leadership when given the opportunity. Her administrative innovations were condemned as examples of improper female interference in masculine domains, but they were also quietly adopted and continued by officials who recognized their practical value. Her fate was cited as evidence that traditional limitations existed for sound reasons, but it also demonstrated that those limitations could be transcended by individuals with sufficient intelligence, determination, and skill. The complexity of this legacy reflected the complexity of Messalina herself, a figure who defied simple categorization as either hero or villain, visionary or destroyer, victim or perpetrator. She had been all of these things at different times and in different contexts, making her story a mirror in which Romans could see reflected their own struggles with the eternal tensions between stability and change, tradition and innovation, collective welfare and individual ambition. The empire she had helped to govern continued its ancient rhythms of expansion and administration, trade and taxation, war and diplomacy. But it did so with a deeper understanding of both the possibilities and the dangers inherent in concentrated power, a more sophisticated awareness of the need for institutional safeguards, and a grudging recognition that even the most cherished traditions might need to evolve to meet the challenges of an ever-changing world. In the quiet gardens where she had once walked, in the palaces where she had held court, in the Senate chambers where she had wielded influence, her absence was palpable, but not absolute. The spaces she had occupied retained the memory of her presence, the echo of her voice, the lingering sense that something extraordinary had passed through those halls and left them forever changed by her passage. And yet, for all the institutional reforms and careful transitions, one question haunted the corridors of the Palatine Hill like a restless spirit. What had driven Messalina to push so far beyond every boundary that even her extraordinary power couldn't protect her? The answer lay not in the grand political strategies or the calculated moves that marked her public career, but in something far more human and infinitely more tragic. Those who had known her in her final months spoke of a woman consumed by a hunger that seemed to grow with every feeding. Each successful manipulation, each eliminated rival, each boundary crossed, had only intensified her appetite for more. The teenage bride who had once trembled at the thought of displeasing Claudius had evolved into someone who believed that rules were merely suggestions, that traditions existed only until she chose to ignore them, that power was a river with no banks. But power, as every Roman understood, was also a drug, and like all intoxicating substances, it demanded ever-increasing doses to produce the same euphoric effects. The influence that had once thrilled Messalina with its novelty became routine, expected, insufficient. The fear she inspired in senators and nobles transformed from a tool into an addiction, something she craved not for its practical benefits, but for the pure rush of watching powerful men bend to her will. This psychological transformation had been gradual, almost imperceptible to those who observed it daily. Friends noticed that she laughed differently at her victories, with a sound that carried less joy and more hunger. Servants whispered about how she would pace her chambers late at night, restless with energies that no amount of luxury or flattery could satisfy. Even her children began to sense something unsettling in their mother's intensity, the way her attention could focus on them with frightening completeness before shifting elsewhere like a searchlight seeking new targets. The relationship with Silius had initially offered something different: genuine partnership, intellectual stimulation, the rare experience of being challenged rather than simply obeyed. For a brief period, their connection had seemed to satisfy needs that power alone could never address. Here was someone who could match her wit, appreciate her intelligence, respond to her as a woman rather than merely as an empress. The early stages of their affair had been marked by conversations that lasted until dawn, debates about philosophy and poetry that revealed depths in both participants that the brutal world of Roman politics rarely allowed to surface. But even this relationship couldn't escape the gravitational pull of Messalina's appetite for dominance. What began as partnership gradually shifted into another form of conquest, another demonstration of her ability to claim whatever she desired. Silius, for all his noble birth and senatorial dignity, became another trophy in her collection, proof that even Rome's most eligible bachelor could be possessed by her will. The very qualities that had initially attracted her, his independence, his aristocratic bearing, his refusal to be easily impressed, became challenges to overcome rather than traits to cherish. The wedding ceremony itself represented the culmination of this process, the moment when partnership transformed completely into possession. By forcing Silius to marry her publicly while she remained wedded to Claudius, Messalina wasn't just claiming him as a husband, she was asserting her right to redefine the most sacred institutions of Roman society according to her personal desires. The man she had once loved became an instrument in her ultimate test of whether Roman civilization would bend to accommodate her will. This progression from affection to exploitation revealed something profound about the corrupting nature of absolute power. Messalina hadn't set out to destroy the man she claimed to love. She had simply become incapable of maintaining any relationship that didn't ultimately serve her need for dominance and control. The woman who could manipulate senators and intimidate generals found it impossible to sustain the vulnerability that genuine love required. Every relationship became political. Every emotion became strategic. Every human connection became another opportunity to demonstrate her supremacy. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that those closest to her recognized what was happening, but felt powerless to intervene. Narcissus had watched her transformation with growing alarm, understanding that each escalation made her more dangerous, not just to others, but to herself. He had tried, in his careful way, to suggest that perhaps she was moving too quickly, pushing too hard, creating unnecessary enemies through actions that served no practical purpose. But by then, Messalina had become incapable of hearing warnings that suggested limitations on her power. Her servants, too, had noticed the changes. Women who had dressed her hair and managed her correspondence for years spoke quietly among themselves about how their mistress seemed to derive less pleasure from her victories, how her triumphs left her restless rather than satisfied. They watched her pace the palace corridors like a caged animal, beautiful and deadly, and increasingly isolated by the very power that had once seemed to promise everything she could desire. Even her children felt the effects of their mother's transformation. Britannicus, still young enough to seek affection without calculating its political implications, found himself increasingly confused by a mother who could be tender one moment and terrifyingly focused the next. Messalina loved her son genuinely, but even that maternal affection became entangled with her political ambitions, her need to secure his future through methods that would ultimately threaten his very survival. The psychological isolation that accompanied her rise created a feedback loop that accelerated her descent into dangerous territory, cut off from genuine human connection by her own inability to trust or be vulnerable. Surrounded by people who feared her too much to offer honest counsel, intoxicated by power that seemed to validate every choice she made, Messalina lost the ability to recognize when she was approaching the point of no return. This internal journey from ambition to obsession played out against the backdrop of an empire that continued its ancient rhythms regardless of palace drama. While Messalina struggled with appetites that couldn't be satisfied, Roman legions maintained order along distant frontiers. While she orchestrated the deaths of perceived enemies, merchants conducted trade that enriched provinces from Britain to Egypt. While she attempted to reshape the fundamental institutions of Roman marriage and governance, ordinary citizens lived their lives according to patterns established by centuries of tradition. This contrast between the intensely personal drama of imperial politics and the vast, impersonal machinery of Roman civilization highlighted one of the most important lessons embedded in Messalina's story. Individual ambition, no matter how extraordinary, ultimately crashed against the weight of collective human experience. The traditions she sought to overturn had been built through generations of trial and error, refined through countless experiments in human organization, validated through their ability to sustain complex societies across vast distances and long periods of time. Her failure wasn't primarily a failure of intelligence or even of character. It was a failure to understand the difference between personal power and institutional authority. She had confused her ability to influence events with the right to reshape civilization itself. The woman who could eliminate senators and manipulate emperors discovered too late that some boundaries existed not as arbitrary restrictions, but as essential foundations that couldn't be removed without causing the entire structure to collapse. This realization came to her only in her final hours, as she faced the consequences of choices that had seemed inevitable at the time she made them. The woman who had believed herself capable of transcending every limitation found herself reduced to the same mortality that claimed all Romans regardless of their power or achievements. The empress who had redefined the possible discovered that possibility itself had limits that even her remarkable will couldn't overcome. But perhaps the most poignant aspect of her final moments was the recognition that flickered across her features as she faced execution. Not regret for her ambitions or shame at her transgressions, but a kind of bewildered surprise that the rules had applied to her after all. She had lived so long in the rarefied atmosphere of absolute power that the return to ordinary human vulnerability came as a shock rather than an expected consequence. The witnesses to her death would remember that expression for years afterward, the way understanding dawned across her face like sunlight breaking through clouds. Here was someone who had spent years believing that intelligence, beauty, and determination could overcome any obstacle, discovering in her final moments that some forces were stronger than individual will. The empire she had sought to remake according to her vision would continue long after her voice was silenced, shaped by currents far deeper and more persistent than any single person could redirect. Her execution, conducted with the formal dignity that Roman law required, became a ritual of restoration as much as punishment. By enforcing the ultimate penalty against someone who had seemed untouchable, the imperial system demonstrated its own resilience, its ability to maintain essential boundaries even when challenged by the most extraordinary individuals. The ceremony itself, witnessed by officials who had once trembled at her displeasure, served notice that Roman civilization would endure regardless of who rose or fell within its structures. Yet even as Messalina's death restored a certain equilibrium to imperial politics, it also marked the end of an era that had briefly expanded the boundaries of what Romans considered possible. Her administrative innovations, her political networks, her demonstration that women could excel in governance, all of these contributions survived her physical destruction, embedded in the institutional memory of an empire that learned from every crisis it survived. The months that followed her execution saw a gradual return to more traditional patterns of imperial administration, but they were traditional patterns informed by lessons learned during her extraordinary career. Future empresses would operate within clearer boundaries, but those boundaries encompassed roles and responsibilities that had been unimaginable before Messalina demonstrated their possibility. The woman who had pushed too far too fast had nonetheless moved the frontier of the possible to territory that could never be completely abandoned. This complex legacy, part cautionary tale, part inspiration, part institutional reform, reflected the fundamental ambiguity that surrounded all exercises of power in the Roman world. The same qualities that made someone capable of great achievements also made them capable of great destruction. The same ambition that drove beneficial innovations could also lead to catastrophic overreach. The same intelligence that solved complex problems could also devise elaborate schemes for personal advancement at the expense of collective welfare. Romans understood these paradoxes intuitively, having watched them play out repeatedly throughout their long history of expansion and governance. They knew that power attracted both the best and worst human impulses, that authority could ennoble or corrupt depending on the character of those who wielded it, that the same individual could serve as both savior and destroyer at different points in their career. Messalina's story fit perfectly into this tradition of moral complexity, offering no simple lessons, but plenty of material for reflection on the eternal dilemmas of leadership and authority. As winter deepened and Rome settled into the rhythms that would define the remainder of Claudius's reign, the emperor himself grappled with emotions and insights that would shape his approach to governance for his remaining years. The man who had trusted completely discovered the necessity of verification. The scholar who had preferred theoretical solutions learned to appreciate practical safeguards. Most importantly, the ruler who had delegated extensively began to understand which responsibilities could be shared and which must remain exclusively imperial. These hard-won insights would serve Claudius well in the challenges that lay ahead, but they came at enormous personal cost. The marriage that had begun with genuine affection and mutual respect had ended in betrayal and execution. The partnership that had promised to combine his scholarly approach with her political instincts had devolved into a shadow government that threatened the very foundations of imperial authority. The woman he had loved had become the greatest threat to everything preserve. The emotional he sought to protect and toll of these realizations was evident to anyone who observed the emperor in the months following Messalina's death. The man who had once approached problems with scholarly detachment now showed signs of the wariness that came from personal betrayal. His decisions carried a new weight of caution. His trust was extended more carefully. His confidence in his own judgment bore the scars of having been so thoroughly deceived by someone he had known intimately. Yet this emotional damage also produced a kind of wisdom that served the empire well. The emperor who had learned to doubt his own perceptions became more willing to seek counsel from multiple sources. The ruler who had discovered the limits of personal trust developed institutional mechanisms that didn't depend on individual loyalty. Most importantly, the man who had been forced to confront his own vulnerability created systems of governance that could function effectively even when personal relationships failed. These developments represented Claudius's most important contribution to Roman imperial tradition, not his military conquests or public works projects, but his demonstration that effective leadership could emerge from personal crisis. that institutional wisdom could grow from individual failure, that the empire could become stronger through learning from its most dangerous internal threats. The woman who had nearly destroyed his reign had ultimately taught him lessons that made him a more effective ruler and Rome a more resilient civilization. The irony was profound and would not be lost on future historians who studied this period. Messalina's greatest service to the empire came not through her administrative innovations or political insights, but through the crisis she created that forced fundamental improvements in imperial governance. Her betrayal taught Claudius lessons about power and trust that no amount of scholarly study could have provided. Her ambition revealed vulnerabilities in the imperial system that might otherwise have remained hidden until exploited by even more dangerous enemies. In this sense, her tragic end served a purpose that transcended personal punishment or political restoration. It became part of the ongoing education of an empire that grew stronger by learning from every challenge it survived. The woman who had sought to reshape Roman civilization according to her personal vision had indeed changed it, but through failure rather than success, through destruction rather than creation, through serving as an example of limits that could not be crossed rather than possibilities that could be achieved. This transformation of tragedy into wisdom represented one of the most remarkable aspects of Roman political culture: its ability to extract useful lessons from even the most painful experiences, to find institutional benefits in personal disasters, to turn individual failures into collective learning opportunities. The empire that had executed Messalina for treason would spend generations studying her career for insights into the nature of power, the importance of institutional safeguards, and the eternal tension between innovation and stability that defined all successful civilizations. Her story would be told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, used to support arguments both for and against expanded roles for women in public life. Some would cite her administrative successes as proof that gender restrictions served no practical purpose. Others would point to her ultimate failure as evidence that traditional limitations existed for sound reasons. Most would recognize the complexity of her legacy, the way she embodied both the potential and the dangers inherent in concentrated power, regardless of who exercised it. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of her influence would be the questions she raised rather than the answers she provided. What were the proper limits of imperial authority? How could individual ambition be channeled to serve collective welfare? What institutional safeguards were necessary to prevent the emergence of shadow governments? How could the empire benefit from the talents of all its citizens while maintaining the stability that came from established traditions? These questions would occupy Roman political thinkers for centuries, driving innovations in governance that might never have been considered if Messalina's career hadn't revealed their necessity. The woman who had pushed beyond every boundary had, in her failure, helped to define the boundaries that would protect the empire from future threats. Her legacy lived not in the institutions she had tried to create, but in the improvements her challenge had inspired in the institutions that survived her. As spring approached, and Rome began another cycle of renewal and growth, as the immediate trauma of her fall receded into the category of historical lessons, rather than current crises, the Eternal City continued its ancient work of transforming individual human dramas into collective wisdom. The woman who had briefly seemed to hold the empire in her hands was gone, but the empire itself remained, strengthened by the ordeal, wiser for the experience, more resilient for having survived its most extraordinary internal challenge. In the gardens where she had once walked, new flowers would bloom according to patterns established long before her birth and destined to continue long after her death. In the palaces where she had held court, new voices would debate the eternal questions of power and responsibility that had consumed her final years. In the Senate chambers where she had wielded unprecedented influence, new leaders would grapple with the same tensions between tradition and innovation that had ultimately claimed her life. But they would do so with the benefit of her example, both positive and negative, to guide their choices and inform their judgment. The empire she had sought to remake had indeed been changed by her passage through it, not according to her vision, but in ways that honored the complexity of her legacy, while protecting against the dangers her career had revealed. She had become part of Rome's eternal conversation with itself about the nature of power, the requirements of leadership, and the price of pushing too far beyond the boundaries that defined civilization itself. In this way, her death became not an ending, but a transformation, not a conclusion, but a continuation of the ancient dialogue between individual ambition and collective wisdom that had always defined the Roman experiment in governance. The woman who had believed herself capable of transcending every limitation had become herself a lesson in the importance of limits, a reminder that even the most extraordinary individuals remain subject to forces larger and more enduring than any single human will. And in that transformation lay perhaps the only kind of immortality that truly mattered, not the personal survival that she had sought through power and influence, but the institutional wisdom that her career had helped to create, the enhanced understanding of human nature and political reality that would guide future generations long after her name had faded from common memory into the province of scholars and storytellers who would continue to grapple with the eternal questions her remarkable life had raised. The empire that had condemned Messalina would spend decades processing the implications of what her career had revealed about power itself. But tonight, as we near the end of this extraordinary story, I want you to consider something that the ancient sources rarely discuss. The ordinary Romans who witnessed these events unfold, the citizens who watched an empress rise to unprecedented heights before crashing down in spectacular ruin. Picture a shopkeeper in the Suburra, Rome's crowded working-class district, hearing whispers about the empress's latest scandal while measuring grain for customers. Imagine a soldier stationed along Hadrian's Wall, receiving garbled reports about palace intrigue that seemed as distant as mythology, yet somehow affected the very legitimacy of the orders he followed. Think about a provincial governor's wife in Gaul, wondering whether Messalina's example meant she too could claim greater authority in her husband's administration, or whether the empress's fate proved that such ambitions were inherently dangerous. These ordinary people, whose names history never recorded, were nonetheless participants in the great drama that Messalina's life represented. They lived through a period when the fundamental assumptions about gender, power, and imperial authority were challenged more directly than ever before in Roman history. Their reactions, their conversations, their private thoughts about what they witnessed would shape Roman culture for generations, even though no historian bothered to document their perspectives. The baker who supplied bread to the palace servants heard stories that never reached official chronicles. The seamstress who repaired tunics for Praetorian guards learned details about imperial security that revealed just how dangerous the situation had become. The teachers who instructed the children of senators absorbed their students' innocent repetitions of conversations overheard in wealthy households, gaining insights into how Rome's elite really viewed their empress's unprecedented behavior. What emerges from these forgotten voices is a picture of a society in genuine uncertainty about what kind of future they were witnessing being born. Messalina's career had shown that a woman could govern effectively, that traditional gender roles might be more flexible than anyone had previously imagined, that the empire itself could function under arrangements that would have been unthinkable to their ancestors. But her downfall demonstrated with equal clarity that such innovations carried enormous risks, that pushing too far beyond established boundaries could destroy even the most powerful individuals. This tension between possibility and danger created a kind of collective anxiety that permeated Roman society during her final months. Citizens found themselves caught between admiration for her achievements and fear of where her ambitions might ultimately lead. They recognized her intelligence and effectiveness, while questioning whether such qualities in a woman might somehow threaten the natural order that had sustained their civilization for centuries. The psychological impact of this uncertainty cannot be overstated. Romans prided themselves on living in a rational, ordered society where laws and traditions provided clear guidance for behavior. Messalina's career had introduced an element of unpredictability that made everyone, from senators to slaves, wonder whether the rules they had always followed might suddenly change without warning. Her ability to eliminate enemies, reward supporters, and reshape policies according to her personal judgment created an atmosphere where traditional protection seemed inadequate, and familiar relationships carried new dangers. This social tension reached its peak during the weeks leading up to her wedding to Silius, when even common citizens could sense that something unprecedented was building. Market conversations carried an undercurrent of nervous excitement, as if people were watching a magnificent building being constructed on a foundation they suspected might not be strong enough to support it. Everyone wanted to witness history in the making, but few were confident about what kind of history they were actually seeing unfold. The wedding itself became a test case for Roman society's capacity to absorb revolutionary change. Those who attended weren't just witnessing a marriage ceremony, they were participating in an experiment to determine whether Roman civilization could expand to accommodate entirely new forms of relationship and authority. The guest list represented a cross-section of imperial society, from ancient senatorial families to newly wealthy merchants, from traditional religious authorities to innovative legal scholars who saw in Messalina's actions the seeds of beneficial reforms. But the very audacity of what they were witnessing also created its own opposition. For every Roman who saw potential in Messalina's innovations, another saw threat to everything they valued about their way of life. Traditional families worried about the example she was setting for their daughters. Conservative religious leaders feared that her violations of marriage law would anger the gods and bring divine punishment upon the entire empire. Military commanders questioned whether they could maintain discipline among troops who might begin to wonder whether all established authorities were equally subject to challenge and overthrow. This polarization of opinion created fault lines that ran through every level of Roman society. Households divided between those who admired the empress's boldness and those who condemned her recklessness. Business partnerships strained under disagreements about whether her policies helped or hurt their interests. Even religious communities split between progressive voices who saw divine inspiration in her rise and traditionalists who interpreted her success as a test of their faith in established values. The resolution of these tensions through Messalina's execution provided a kind of collective relief, but it was relief tinged with genuine regret for possibilities that would never be explored. Many Romans had been genuinely curious about what kind of society might emerge if women were granted greater roles in public life, if imperial authority could be shared more widely, if innovation were valued more highly than tradition in determining policy. Her fall answered those questions definitively, but in ways that left many citizens wondering what opportunities might have been lost along with the dangers that were averted. The aftermath of her death revealed just how deeply her career had affected Roman thinking about fundamental questions of governance and social organization. Conversations in taverns and bathhouses continued to wrestle with the implications of what they had witnessed. If a woman could govern as effectively as Messalina had demonstrated, why were such opportunities generally denied to half the population? If traditional marriage law could be violated so flagrantly by someone of sufficient power, what did that say about the supposed sacred nature of such institutions? If the emperor himself could be deceived and manipulated so thoroughly by his own wife, how could ordinary citizens trust that their leaders possessed the wisdom necessary to govern effectively? These questions had no easy answers, and their persistence in popular discourse showed that Messalina's impact extended far beyond the immediate political crisis she had created. She had introduced ideas into Roman public consciousness that would continue to influence thought and behavior long after her physical destruction. The woman who had been executed for threatening imperial stability had nonetheless succeeded in expanding the range of possibilities that Romans could imagine for their future development. Perhaps most significantly, her career had demonstrated that exceptional individuals could emerge from unexpected quarters and achieve things that had previously seemed impossible. This realization was both inspiring and terrifying for ordinary citizens, who had been raised to believe that social positions were fixed by birth, tradition, and divine will. If someone like Messalina could rise from relative obscurity to effective co-rule of the known world, what did that say about the potential that might lie dormant in anyone who possessed sufficient ambition and opportunity? This democratization of imperial possibility created new anxieties alongside new hopes. Parents found themselves wondering whether they should encourage their children to aim higher than previous generations had thought appropriate. Teachers debated whether educational curricula should be expanded to prepare students for roles that might not have existed when their own training was designed. Even slaves and freedmen began to reconsider their assumptions about the limits of their own advancement, inspired by the example of someone who had transcended every boundary through sheer force of will and intelligence. The institutional changes that Claudius implemented in response to Messalina's challenge reflected his understanding that her career had revealed genuine flaws in imperial administration that needed correction regardless of personal considerations. The shadow government she had created had proved remarkably effective in many areas, suggesting that the official structures of Roman governance were inadequate for managing an empire of such complexity and scale. Her networks of information gathering, policy coordination, and personnel management had filled gaps that formal institutions had failed to address. But incorporating these innovations into legitimate governmental structures required careful navigation of the same social tensions that had surrounded Messalina herself. Officials who recognized the practical value of her approaches had to find ways to implement them that didn't appear to endorse her treasonous methods. Senators who had benefited from her informal consultation processes needed to create formal equivalents that provided similar benefits, without threatening traditional authority structures. Most challenging of all, the emperor had to find ways to expand imperial administrative capacity without creating new opportunities for future empresses to accumulate dangerous levels of independent power. And so ends the story of Valeria Messalina, a woman who dared to rewrite the rules of an empire, only to discover that some boundaries cannot be crossed without consequence. Her rise from teenage bride to shadow empress reveals timeless truths about power's intoxicating nature and its ultimate limits. Though history remembers her fall, her legacy lives on in the questions she forced Rome to confront about leadership, innovation, and the eternal tension between individual ambition and collective wisdom. Perhaps that's her true immortality, not in the power she wielded, but in the conversations about possibility and restraint that her extraordinary life continues to inspire across the centuries.